welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today we're going to talk about tennis IQ and how to really learn how to play the game of tennis more. And we'll kind of expand on that as we go along. But we're going to rely on a model of tennis IQ. And as you hear that term, you all may have your own definition of what that is. And I know when I work with players, Josh, I'll ask them what they think tennis IQ is, what it means. And very often, the answers are good. It's strategy, tactics, how to play the game, making good decisions, etc., all that. But I think for today's discussion, we're going to rely on a model from Jorge Capestany. So Jorge was one of our guests in early days of the podcast. And he has what I think is a great way of thinking about tennis IQ, because if you can actually go search his YouTube channel and find his video on what is tennis IQ. And he opens that up by basically agreeing that tennis IQ and things like strategy, they're definitely related. In fact, strategy and tactics are a major part of tennis IQ. But he describes a model of tennis IQ that he likes to use with his players to get them really thinking in the right way. It's really more, I would say, directions of thinking. So here's his model, and then I want to get your thoughts on the model after I describe this. So the first level of tennis IQ is more for the beginning player. And he describes it as the player and the ball. And so if you think about when players first begin to play tennis, I mean, there's a lot going on. And they're not really sure exactly what's happening out there. They don't have much control of hitting the ball. They may not even have a very good sense of what their strokes should look like. And all they can really, as he says, handle at that point is just them and this ball. But after a period of time, and you start to develop some control and your skills start to smooth out and even out and maybe begin to bring some consistency, maybe even get to the place where you can play a game, play a match. Then you go to level 2. Now, level 2 is more just about your side of the court. So he talks about how at this point, we're making more decisions about where we want to make contact. Maybe it's right about the waist level or whatever. We're thinking about our footwork. We may be thinking about other technical aspects of the game, but it's really much more just about our side of the court. And then level 3, which he refers to as pro level tennis IQ, and I would agree. And although I have worked with some players at a very high level who are not necessarily always at level 3. But level 3 is understanding more about the opponent's side of the court. And this is where I think we begin to graduate toward learning to win the game. Distinguishing between looking good and being effective. And so we're concerned with the other side of the court, meaning that we want to know a little bit more about what our opponents like to do, what they don't like to do, what makes them comfortable and uncomfortable, so that we can begin to formulate some of our own strategy there and go after, what they don't like to do. Ultimately, that's what we want to do. And so I think this is a very useful model because many players are kind of stuck in that level 2 piece where they're very concerned about themselves. And I find myself, Josh, talking about this concept a lot, even with the high-level college teams and high-level college players that I work with, because there's so much focus on what I'm doing and more specifically, what I'm doing wrong, right? And it becomes a lot more about my skills than it is about how am I applying pressure to win this match. And so because I find, and I'm sure you find the same, that I'm talking about this a lot, I think this makes sense as a great episode to help people understand how to win the game more. and what to really focus on, and maybe even come up with some mindsets and mantras that can help people. So I want to stop there, Josh, and just get your thoughts on that model of tennis IQ.
Yeah, I was excited when you mentioned this as a potential episode idea because I think I also don't always see players, even high level players, applying this type of thinking to their games. Oftentimes if we're talking about a match and how a match went, it's a lot more about that level one or level two in terms of okay, I wasn't finding the rhythm with my strokes, or maybe my footwork wasn't to where I wanted to be in terms of level two, in terms of maybe the footwork or your positioning in the court, but not always thinking in this level three way in terms of how we can apply that to the opponent and to the opponent's side of the court, applying our own strengths, applying our own attributes of our game to what we can then do against our opponent, trying to identify their weaknesses, trying to use our strengths to the opponent's weaknesses. And I would say it's definitely this concept is definitely connected to a book that I know we've mentioned a lot on the show. It's definitely one of my favorite books, period, I would say. And it's Winning Ugly. And I read that book back in high school, and I certainly recommended it to teammates and to players I've coached on the court and on the sports psychology side. And really, what that book is it shows that you can without changing anything about your game, without changing anything about your strokes, you are able to you know by just understanding the game better and understanding what the opponent is doing, you are able to be a lot more effective out there. I mean, Brad Gilbert talks a lot about being able to use your strengths to the opponent's weaknesses, being able to identify during a match who's doing what to whom, right? So, okay, let's say you go down 4-1 in the first set. There's different ways to respond to that. You can be upset and saying, okay, I'm far too inconsistent right now. I'm making too many errors. Or you can, take a step back and try to say, what's really happening? What are actually the dynamics at play that's causing the score to be the way it is right now? Um, so having that understanding, and it takes time, but having that understanding of what the opponent is trying to do, whether successfully or not, is and once you have that understanding, it can certainly take your game to that next level. I think an important point here is that regardless of your level, regardless of even professionals, it's not realistic to think that you're going to 100% of the time be thinking in a level three way, that you're constantly going to be thinking about your opponent's side of the court and how you can apply your own game to the opponent's side of the court. Because there might be situations where maybe if you're not playing as well, maybe if one of your strokes in particular hasn't been has been misfiring, or you've been hitting too many errors, where you might want to take a step back and go back to maybe thinking about level one in terms of yourself and the ball, right? Maybe you're not doing some of these fundamental aspects that I know we'll touch on more. But no, I would say within this model, as you sort of climb up the ranks, it allows a player to not just get into a competition of who has better strokes on a given day. Okay, is my forehand better than yours, and I'm going to win? I think that's a very sort of base level of thinking here. It's more like, okay, am I able to apply my own game effectively against my opponents? Sabotaging whatever they're trying to do against me, putting them in uncomfortable positions, and using my own strengths in an effective way.
I think you brought up an important point there about, we're never really sort of 100% in one level or another. Even if you're playing great, you're not 100% level three. But what I notice when working with players, because a lot of people will say, and I bet people who are listening will say, hey, I might be at level three. I think about the opponent. But if we were to say, download your last 100 tennis thoughts and we were categorize them into these different levels, we would probably find most of them in the level two category. Maybe 70-30, 80-20. And to me, the message here is, can we flip that ratio? I think it's fine to have some level 2 thoughts when you're out there. That may help you actually simplify some things. So, for example, um, you could say something to yourself like, okay, I need to attack that contact point. Okay, that might help you release some tension, etc. Make good contact with the ball, etc. It's definitely a level 2 thought, right? So your side, it's about something you're doing. But at the same time, you have purpose with how you're playing. So you could have more level 3 thoughts about, okay, why am I doing what I'm doing? I'm not just hitting balls. And you see a lot of players who are sort of a see ball, hit ball type of thing, and their only strategy is hit hard, harder, and harder until the point ends. And that's not really playing chess as far as tennis goes. That's really more of a, you're not really understanding how to play the game. So I think level 3 and level 2, the relationship isn't 100% level 3, 0% level 2. It's understanding a good ratio of those. And based on how we're playing, we may have to drop back into level 2 or level 1. But ultimately, why do we want to be at level 3? I think level 3, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, is a recognition that tennis is a combat sport. Your opponent is the person on the other side of the net. Very often, our level 2 thoughts are directed at ourselves, almost as ourselves as the opponent. And that can be harmful. As I said earlier, when I go to a college practice, I'll just listen to the audible self-talk. And it's all about mistakes. It's almost 100% negative. Everybody's seeing themselves as the problem, as opposed to solving the actual problem, which is on the other side of the net. Like, you had a great example, Josh. Somebody might be focused on their mistakes. And then you said, well, you need to kind of look at what the dynamics are, right? The dynamics might be the reason for the mistakes. Like, your opponent might be doing something that is causing you to make mistakes. But if you're just putting it all on you, you probably don't solve that problem. You probably continue to fight yourself. So I think number one, level 3 is understanding this is a fight. And once you get over learning to fight yourself, then you can go out and fight the opponent more. I think level 3 is also the idea of playing with purpose. Why am I hitting certain shots? Why am I using certain patterns? How do I apply pressure in different ways so that I can win? You brought up Brad Gilbert winning ugly. That is probably like the culmination of playing good level 3 tennis. It's winning ugly. Right there in the title, it tells you it's not winning pretty. Nobody cares. There's nothing in the score line that says, oh, Josh not only won, but he looked fantastic doing it. That's just not the purpose of this, right? You don't get extra points for looking beautiful here. So, what Brad Gilbert was able to do, and let's remind people of his college coach's scouting report on Brad, which was good forehand, decent serve, no backhand, wins matches. That guy got to number 4 in the world because he understood that this was a fight. He understood how to apply pressure in the right ways, and he didn't fight himself as much as maybe some others. Right? I'm sure there were moments where he did have some level 2 thoughts that were kind of inward, but for the most part, he knew exactly what he was doing with what he had and how to best apply what he had. And I think another aspect of level 3, and maybe we can bring in some of our conversation with David Samuel here, it's about making the opponent mentally uncomfortable. We've talked many times about breaking the opponent mentally, breaking them physically. Let's make them mentally uncomfortable. So these are all reasons that we want to get more of our thoughts onto that level 3. And a part of that is accepting what is happening in the moment It's accepting, whatever you have on that particular day. And the more you can do not to fight yourself, and as you said, Josh, understand the dynamics of the match so you can actually solve the problem. The problem probably has more to do with the dynamics of the match than there's some technical problem with my forehand. I would say, especially at the higher levels, the reason your strokes are breaking down in a match is never technical. Now, there might be a technical symptom as a result of what your opponent is doing to you, or you feeling pressure, or anger, or whatever. But if we were to take you off the court and put you on the practice court, you're probably perfect technically. So it's never technically the issue, right? Once you get to a certain level. Um, that's what I really like about level 3. I'll often tell players, well, I think there's a level 4. Level 4 is the purpose of level 3, which is to break the opponent mentally. However you want to phrase it, um, the more thoughts we can have at level 3 and really be looking to play the game to really fight the fight, the more interesting tennis will become for you as a competitor.
I like that. I like how you finished that in terms of it should be interesting. I like thinking of it as sort of like a creative process, or almost like solving a puzzle out there. Thinking of your opponent as a puzzle, and knowing that every player has weaknesses, has cracks in their game. But sometimes it takes time to figure that out. Maybe it's and there's different ways to do this. Maybe during the warm up, you test them out, test them on certain types of shots. Maybe it's a really low ball, right? You hit a low slice, or maybe it's certain types of volleys that are uncomfortable. So thinking about using that warm up time, but also during a match, it might take some time to really figure out what types of tactics are going to be most effective at making them uncomfortable, at bringing them away from their best game. I know we've talked about in the past in other episodes how if something's not going well, you can essentially change one of two things. You can try to figure out how to raise your own level, or you can figure out how to lower the opponent's level. And in terms of raising your own level, there's certainly things you could do there. But in terms of sort of lowering the opponent's level or sabotaging what they're trying to do, having a really clear idea of what their weaknesses are, and again, that might take time to figure out. So having a clear idea of that, but what you should definitely have a clear idea of is your own game, right? So you can sort of build a stronger sense of the opponent's strengths and weaknesses as the match goes along. Maybe you have an idea going into it, but you should have a pretty clear sense of your own game. And again, maybe on a day-to-day basis that varies a little bit in terms of what your best strengths are on that given day. But being able to have the awareness to capitalize on that, to capitalize on those dynamics, really starts with that understanding of your own game, and that being able to pick up on those weaknesses as they start to emerge over the course of a match.
I think you're right. You got to know your own game, first of all. And you ought to be designing your game to apply pressure. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. But let's talk about, when you're trying to apply in your game and you're trying to find pressure points, there are definitely going to be some weaknesses to look for on the other side of the net. Now, some of the obvious ones are, particular strokes. Like most people hate high backhands. So that's one you should automatically target in a warm up or early on in the match to see how they handle that. And maybe they can handle 2, but can they handle 3 or 4 over there? Their movement may be an obvious weakness. Maybe even their emotional control, their body language. That may be an obvious weakness. So, hey, I just need to get this guy to make a few mistakes and he's going to lose it, right? But there are many other subtle ones that I think are important to talk about. And I have an example with a student that I'm working with now. And one is this sort of shot or rally tolerance. So I was working with this player. She played a national event a few weeks ago, and she talked about how her opponent was handling what she was doing. And so she decided, well, she's handling it. I gotta, try some variety. I'll try some drop shots and slices. And then she discovered that her opponent was handling that. It's like, well, I got to get even trickier and trickier. But with every sort of step that she went down in terms of variety and getting trickier and trickier, what happened? She was increasing her likelihood of making a mistake. And I said, well, how many shots did you actually wait before in the rally before you said, well, she's handling it? It was pretty early, Josh. It was like 3 or 4. And it's like, oh, well, how do you know that she could handle 5 or 6? You never even tried that. And so very often, having patience and having your own good shot rally tolerance, you may have to wait longer. As you get better, players' breaking points in rallies will probably be longer and longer. And sometimes the answer is be more patient. Continue to hit that cross court backhand to their backhand and so forth. So to me, that's a subtle weakness to look for. Look for, maybe the decision making that your opponent makes. That's not an obvious one, but hey, maybe they like going down the line often when they're pulled into the doubles alley. Maybe they make that shot 2 out of 10 times, but you should take that. Take the other 8. So you may see decision making. You may notice their ability to handle pressure late in sets as something to take advantage of. You may notice their conditioning as a match goes along. And there are probably a lot of other subtle things that we can look for, but we want to understand these because then you can begin to craft your game around that. How do I put more pressure? Because if you watch guys like Djokovic and Nadal, especially on clay courts, they are really testing their opponent's patience and rally tolerance. A lot of times they win matches, especially second sets, easy because the opponent just isn't up for it to stay out there that long and hit that many balls, etc. They're going to just start going for winners, and they raise basically they raise their risk of making mistakes. So I think it's good for all of us to understand what are some of those pressure points that we can really lean on in matches so that when we have strengths, we can apply those to those things.
Yeah, I like that, and I would say one of the biggest that comes to mind in terms of applying pressure would be coming up to net.
Yeah.
That's to me one of the best ways to apply pressure to the opponent. It's important to remember if it's late in the set, if the score is tight, it's not just you that's feeling the pressure. The opponent is likely going through the same, very similar, collection of emotions in that moment. So if you come to net and it's a big point, it's deuce, you're putting a lot of pressure on your opponent to come up with the shot there, to come up with the goods. So that's certainly one of the better ways to apply pressure. Sometimes you'll come up to net and they'll just miss the passing shot. You won't actually have to hit the volley. And especially if they're tight, especially if it's a big point, it just becomes tougher. So that's a big one. I would say also after, let's say you play a long point, you mentioned shot or rally tolerance. That's definitely a time where, right after a long, draining, exhausting point, are you confident that you can play another one? Because your opponent might be less likely to be able to hang in a 15, 20 shot rally in that following point. So those are a couple that come to mind in terms of applying pressure in some, I guess, unique ways. What are some that come to mind for you?
Well, I like those. I think for some of us, if you happen to be someone with a big serve, that is in itself a pressure applying aspect of your game. Because if, let's say, I'm playing a big server, I'm automatically going to feel more pressure to hold myself because I might feel like I can't break this guy. And if I lose my serve, it's over. And I'm sure a lot of people feel this even at the pro level with guys like Isner and Riley Opelka and Ivo Karlovic. They're difficult to break And so a lot of the sets they go to are tiebreakers, or they win. They'll have one break. And so yeah, maybe improving your serve, making your serve a real weapon, can be very much a means of applying pressure. Or if you're a serve and volleyer, that's like you said, even just getting to net more. And as you said, the getting to net more and putting your opponent in a position where they have to make a shot, it made me think of our opponents are just like us. So, like, if you don't want to be in that situation, your opponent probably doesn't either. So, use that information to your advantage and put them intentionally in positions that you think will make them uncomfortable. If they make you uncomfortable, they probably make the opponent uncomfortable. And that could be as simple as, hey, I don't like hitting high backhands. I bet my opponent doesn't either. Let me go there. I don't like playing long points. Maybe I try that. I don't like having to hit passing shots under pressure. Okay, let me be the one to make the opponent. Like, now you're thinking less about you and more about how you win the game. So whenever you're thinking about your own game and how to win more and how to win the game more, I think it's a lot about how you apply different types of pressure. Again, knowing yourself, knowing that your opponent is a lot like you in many ways. And I think sometimes we have a danger, Josh, of overestimating the mental game of the opponent, thinking that we're not thinking about it enough. That so and so, well, they're tough and they've got this ranking or rating or whatever, but everybody's breakable. And so we don't want to overestimate. And I think we talked a little bit about this in our last episode, the idea of respect all, fear none. But even the people who we're even with, we might be overestimating their mental abilities and using that as a bit of an excuse. Have the courage to do what you need to do and make them prove it. So when we are like estimating or judging, we're not making the opponent prove anything. We're just assuming. So we want to make sure that they can prove they can handle the pressure that we're putting them under.
Yeah, I like that. And I think for each player, they can apply pressure in different ways. You mentioned some players are bigger servers. That's a definite way to apply strength. Let's say for some players, their strengths more lie in their returns, in their consistency. Just by making more balls in the court, just by making more returns in play, you give yourself a chance. You put more pressure on the server to finish off the point or close out the game or whatever it may be. So thinking about how you can use your strengths, and again, that comes back to this having a clear understanding of where your strengths lie, but thinking about how you can use your strengths to apply pressure based on that understanding. Another one could be making them hit their weakest shot over and over again. Let's say it's a backhand, right? Making them hit 5 backhands in a row. Will it break down, right? Making them hit 75% backhands on a given day. Make them beat you with their weaker shot, I think is a tip. If you're going to go out and lose, you want to make sure that you've tried everything. You want to make sure that you're not that they're not necessarily beating you with their best stuff, but you're putting them in a position to try to come up with the goods on their weaker side. And yeah, I mean, thinking about what are some things that you struggle with or that most players struggle with. You mentioned high backhands. I think also certain types of volleys, right? I can't think of too many players that like, high backhand volleys or overheads or, low volleys, right? So really, and again, this takes time. There's never been a case where somebody just picks up the game with this sort of an understanding. It takes time learning the game. It takes match play experience to really come to this understanding of what's going to be effective and what sorts of shots are going to be effective in manipulating or sort of sabotaging the opponent's goals. And that was actually one of the things I liked a lot when we had Jorge Capestany on for our interview when we talked about, sabotaging and being able to sabotage the opponent's game plan, which sometimes takes us, changing up our own games in order to do that, but also thinking about how we can build in time during practice to practice some of those sabotage techniques. Maybe it's using the slice more, maybe it's serve and volleying, whatever it may be, just thinking about how we can really sort of systematically break down the opponent's game and look to practice that so that we're practicing bringing the opponent down to a lower level, not just, constantly working on our own games and our own strokes.
I think disrupting rhythm is another way of, again, playing level 3, right? We're not just giving the opponent what he or she wants. I want to go back to that, hitting to the weaker shot over and over again, because you'll watch players, they'll start off, maybe hit a couple shots over there, and then they'll, for no real good reason, go to the other side. Almost like, well, I have to change it up, and they have all these sort of what-if scenarios going on. Well, if I hit too many shots over there, their backhand will get better. And I'm like, well, how do you know that? Like, you're projecting this. Make them prove that they can do it before you decide to change. And it's you often will see players not be boring. They'll try to mix these things up, and you'll hit a couple to the backhand, then they'll go to the forehand, and you're just setting yourself up to possibly lose your dominant position in the point by going to the opponent's better stroke intentionally. So I think when we talk about hitting to the weaker shot, you want to do that over and over and over again. Be boring. Make them, like you said, Josh, make them win it with that shot. If they can, well then, kudos to them. But you don't want to let them in the match because you chose not to apply enough pressure to that weak shot. That would be a strategic mistake on your part and would not really be, good level 3 thinking something else. So I think that's really important. The idea of people not liking volleys, I think is great. No one really likes high. It's hard to be effective off that high backhand volley. It's, I think, especially under pressure, difficult even for some Division 1 college players to hit overheads late in sets. There's a lot riding on that shot, and you feel the pressure because we all have in this, in our minds that should be a put away shot. And maybe that's too much the dominant thought as opposed to actually executing the shot. So lobbing at a good, nice high lob is something absolutely should engage in, especially at the end of sets. Make somebody come up with that under pressure. But ultimately, everyone is breakable, and I think we have to go out there understanding that. And the better that you become as a tennis player, the more you're going to have to push on these pressure points to really find that breaking point. And when I said that if you can do this, tennis will become more interesting, I remember, Josh, many years ago, when I first went out onto the court with that goal of breaking somebody mentally. I hadn't really heard of that before, so I was like, all right, I'm going to try this. I'm going to really purpose my game towards breaking this opponent mentally. And when it actually happened, it completely changed how I viewed the sport. It's one thing to read it or hear it about doing that. It's a whole nother to go out there with that purpose and then see your opponent go to a place where they didn't want to go and understand that you did that. You're the one that did that. And the match I'm thinking about, it started off like 2-all or 3-all and ended up, I think, 6-3, 6-0. And even talking to the opponent at the end, he was kind of not very gracious about the whole thing, saying, well, there are better players than you around. And I was like, all right, fine. And I knew just him making those excuses, I did that. I made him make those excuses. He had to protect his self-esteem that losing to me by that score, well, there were other things going on, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, okay, that's fine. But that even in itself was a sign that I had gotten to him, mentally. And how we all do that is different. As we've said, how I apply pressure in my game is very different than how others do that same thing. And if the listeners can really grasp and embrace this model of focusing more on what your opponent is doing, putting more pressure, making them mentally uncomfortable, thinking a little bit less about yourself, and looking at that more, like I said, it will make tennis more interesting. Um, and I think you'll reach another level of consciousness as a tennis player and a tennis competitor. And I think that's ultimately what we want to help people do. Are there going to be days where your game is faltering? Yes. And maybe you have to go all the way back to level one, and it's back to me in the ball. And it's back to me just watching the ball. That may actually be something you need to do just to rebuild your confidence. But as you rebuild your confidence, you can begin to expand the levels again. Get back into level two. Get back into level three as quickly as you can. So it's not about 100% level three. We may traverse between one and three, all in the span of a match. But ultimately, if our when we go out into the court, the high level goal is to be at level three and to make the opponent uncomfortable. If you get that, then it's easier to go between these different ways of thinking.
Yeah, so I would say that I have had similar experiences, both in terms of USTA, in terms of high school, college tennis, and where I have certainly also had matches where I felt that I broke the opponents. And I think my particular way of doing that was sort of through consistency, was through changing up the spins, was through trying to make them uncomfortable, maybe having to hit a weaker shot over and over again. But I actually think I fell into a little bit of a trap that I think is important to caution against, where I at times would stop thinking about my own game and my own strengths. At times, go almost too far over to that side, and would solely be thinking about the opponent and, okay, what am I doing to, okay, am I finding their weaknesses without necessarily applying my own strengths? So I think what's important here is to make sure that both pieces, and what I was doing wasn't true level three thinking. I was just thinking about the manipulation piece or the sabotage piece without, thinking about that, that I would say level two, that sort of makes it up. That I wasn't doing everything on my side of the court within my control. I was sort of skipping a level, thinking about, thinking about doing things that would break down the opponents. And I can be a little bit more concrete, where my backhand is definitely stronger than my forehand, as it always has been. But I would have matches where, rather than hitting through it and being aggressive with my topspin backhand, I would end up slicing a lot, with the idea that this is something that's going to throw off my opponent. This is the type of thing that maybe they don't like. They're not able to hit as much pace, or using it as an approach shot, or different things. But what would happen was I sort of would become this, at times, not when I was playing my best, but some of the matches that I look back at, without feeling like I played particularly well, I felt like I at times went almost into like a junk baller type of mode, rather than still hitting through the ball. I would sort of go away from that and just go into this sort of sabotage mode, without actually applying my own strengths and what I do well. Just try to break down the opponent, which wasn't effective. What I found was that when I am using my strengths well and playing in an aggressive way, but with that awareness of what is going to be effective in terms of what they, what parts of their game they're lacking in, and applying it to that level three, that's when I was most effective. So I think that's just an important point, that as we try to play more using this level three thinking, we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of our own strengths and our own, what we do well and what we traditionally win matches with. But we just want to make sure that we are utilizing that in the service of breaking down the opponent's game. And bringing their level down and having that full understanding of their side of the court.
I think for a variety of reasons, sometimes we can lose track of our own identity as players. And your story is a good one because you did, in a way, lost your a sense of really you at your best. You went to this other thing, and while maybe effective at times, maybe it was a little bit more passive than you
Mm-hmm.
would prefer to play, more than an active and aggressive means of applying your strengths. And so I do think that's a really good point to bring up is, am I playing my game? Or if, for a variety of reasons, have I been sucked into something else? Sometimes the opponent is successful at bringing us to their game. Or, like you said, it really wasn't the opponent who brought you there. You didn't end up playing his game. You just sort of went to something else and you just lost your own sense of identity out there. Um, and so, having a good sense of your identity, knowing your strengths and how you apply them, is really important. Because, like, I think of a guy like Roger Federer, and when we had Sean Brawley on the podcast, and he talked about how after the 2017 Australian Open that Federer won in 5 sets over Nadal, he asked him one very simple question: "How'd you do it?" And the answer was that when Roger's playing his best, all he's thinking about is him and the ball, watching the ball. Now that, on the face of it, sounds like he's a level one thinker. Okay, but Roger's got a very mature game, one in which has been well designed to put pressure on the opponent through aggressiveness. He almost doesn't even have to think so much, given his offensive style. Doesn't really even have to think that much about the level 3 stuff because he just does what he does. And he can simplify it down to, all right, I just need to watch the ball. And anybody who's watched videos of Roger hitting balls and seeing it at slow motion does a very good job of tracking the ball. Um, and so, but if he didn't have that great sense of who he was, Josh, I don't, he would have to think a little bit more about what I'm doing. And it's not that like Djokovic and Nadal don't have that sense, but they're generally more on the defensive side of things. So sometimes they're reacting more than they are directing. Sometimes, it's not that Federer can't play defense, but he's pretty much offense first. And he's going to be looking for first strike and using his forehand, etc. And so he has such a good sense of that. He's such a mature player that it's hard for him to forget that identity. For us, for most of us, we really have to engage with, hey, am I playing my game? Am I imposing my game on somebody else, or is somebody imposing their game on me? Or am I just too passive? And so I think it's a really important point that you brought up.
And I think if we think about at the professional level, a couple players that come to mind in terms that I think are really good at applying pressure. On the women's side, I think of Ons Jabeur as somebody that uses the slice really well, uses the drop shot, is very often brings the opponent out of their comfort zone, sort of through her creativity, through being able to mix it up, through using her strengths in those areas to keep opponents on their toes, keep them guessing. And another example of that on the men's side is Maxime Cressy, that maybe not everybody's familiar with. He played at UCLA. He is now, he's now top 100 in the world. I don't know his exact ranking, but he's had some great results recently. I know he was in a final of a 250 ATP 250 in January in Australia against Nadal, and also played a really tight match against Medvedev. It won 4 sets, 4 very tight sets at the Australian Open. And he's very tall. He's 6'8". He serves really well. He actually serves in volleys, which is extremely rare these days. Can't think of too many players that I would categorize as serving volleyers anymore. So I think since he plays in a unique way, and again using his strengths as a server, as a good volleyer, to apply that pressure to the opponents, he's able to keep keep people guessing and sort of prevent them in a certain way from getting comfortable and playing their best tennis. And again, this doesn't mean that all of us need to go and become serve volleyers or use the drop shot and the slice like Ons Jabeur. But what we want to be doing is trying to identify, hey, are there certain tactics that the opponent might have a tougher time with, like coming to net more, like maybe bringing them up to net more as well. That's I think definitely an underused tactic. You mentioned Federer. That's something that I think he does really well in terms of using sort of a slice, a short slice that forces the opponent into the net, and then passing them from there. That's actually a particular tactic that can be helpful against certain types of players, like for example, like the ultra consistent player, pusher type that they're sometimes called. We sometimes talked about coming into net against that type of player, but you can also think about bringing them up to net, right? If going back to this point, if we're playing somebody who's primarily a baseliner, they generally stay at the baseline most of the time for a reason. They're generally not as comfortable at the net. So if you can think about how can you bring them into net, maybe it's through a drop shot. The drop shots can be risky, as we know. So the short slice could also be an option to bring them into the net, sort of bring them out of that comfort zone in order to try to pass them from there.
For sure. That's a great shot to use. And it's making them hit up on the ball, even if they don't come in. They're hitting up on that ball. It can be difficult to be offensive on that ball. May give you an opening to do something with your next ball. If I think about now level 3 a little bit more on the mental side, Josh, I feel like, and maybe this is a Brad Gilbert thing as well, a player who is really predominantly at level 3 is very good at being in the moment. For example, let's say you're 5-all in the first set, or second set, doesn't matter. It's not about how you got there. Because there are a lot of permutations for how one could get to 5-all. You could have been up 5-0. You could have been down 0-5. It could have been 5-2 or 2-5, right? There are a lot of ways you could have gotten there. But once you're there, that doesn't matter anymore. And I think the level 3 player understands, okay, we're at the business end of the set. It's 5-all. What am I going to do now? And again, another Jorge Capestany thing is, what's important now? That's what WIN stands for. What's important now? It's totally irrelevant how you arrived at that moment. If you're beating yourself up for how you got there, you're at level 2. You're not actually playing the game to win. You're more concerned about what you look like and perfection and all these other things that are great, but they don't really matter when it comes to actually winning the match. You have to be in that moment. And that's what a really good level 3 player does. That's why we've talked so much about being in the moment, using your routines to help you be in the moment more, help you understand what's right in front of me now. Maybe it's just I just need to play a really good point right here. I need to really work the opponent, play long point, get him or her tired, or I need to put on some pressure. If you're at 5-all, you have just as good a chance as anybody to win that set. And I think that's really what a true level 3 player is going to realize in that moment, regardless of how they arrived at 5-all.
Yeah, if it's 5-all, we don't want to just be upset that we're at that point, right? We talked about actually just in our last episode what to do if you're supposed to win or lose. If you're supposed to win and somebody tells you, oh, that'll be easy, and then it's 5-all, are you upset that you're playing such a close match against this person that you were supposed to beat easily, or are you thinking about what's important now and thinking about what are the tactics that I need to execute here, and keeping it simple too. These, when we talk about tactics, I think sometimes that it can almost feel a little bit daunting for some players. So just having maybe 2 or 3 big tactics that you like to use. Maybe it's the serve out wide, and it's going with your forehand, hitting, going to the other side with that next ball, or maybe it's a certain type of return and following that up with a certain shot. But keeping it simple, not generally just a couple shots, two maybe three shots in a tactic, but trying to have a clear sense for, okay, what's important now, what sorts of tactics do I have to should I keep in mind? What are the most important things to keep in mind here? Maybe it's 5-all, and okay, I know my opponent's probably tight here. I'm returning. I might have some more looks at second serves here, right? So with that knowledge in mind, maybe there's specific things you want to do on that second serve. Maybe you want to look to attack it. Maybe you want to look to run around it, or you want to look to chip and charge, or whatever it is. But having that understanding of the opponent, and again, not just their strengths on the physical side or tactical side, but also on the mental side, that there's a greater likelihood that they might be tight here. And to me, that's an understanding of the opponent and of their side of the court, but it's also an understanding of the game, right? It's an understanding that people are more likely to be tight in that situation. And so that might be a time where they're more vulnerable and more of a chance to attack at that point.
And if you're in level 2, what's happening to you? You're probably the one who's tight. You have that second serve, and what are you thinking? Oh, I can't miss this.
Yep.
And you've lost really all purpose for how to play that, right? So that's a good example, Josh. Any last thoughts on how to play level 3 of Tennis IQ?
I would say match reflection can do a lot to get better at this. Can play an important role in improving at this skill. When after you play a match, taking the time to go through it and really thinking about what you did well, what you didn't do as well, what you can learn from that match, but also trying to think, were there ways to utilize the information at hand in terms of your own strengths and your opponent's weaknesses that maybe you didn't capitalize on. This is a skill. Thinking in this way is a skill, right? So it's something that takes practice that you're not going to just immediately be able to do it at the highest level. So it's after each match, along with identifying your own game and your own strokes, identifying how you did at this type of thinking, I think is very important. Were you able to manipulate or sabotage the opponent? Were you able to take the advantage or take the information that you were given and use that to your advantage? Or were you more thinking in this level 1, level 2 way in terms of, okay, I want to set up my forehand because that's my strength. Okay, great. We want to set up our forehand. We want to use that strength, but how can we use that in the best possible way based on the information that we have, based on the information that we've accumulated over the course of a match?
I think it's a great tip, and I think perhaps to facilitate that, let's go into a specific practice match with a process goal of playing level 3. So that when you come to the reflection time, you can come back and really properly assess that goal rather than maybe have other things. And, well, did I play level 3? I wasn't as focused on that as I should have been, perhaps. Like you said, this way of thinking is a skill, so do it in practice. Make it a focal point of what you do. And then you can really assess how you're doing and learn from that whole process, right? So great point, Josh. So that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.